Hello, everybody, and welcome to May 2019 Faster Masters Rowing Radio. I'm Rebecca Caroe, and today, of course, I'm with my colleague Marlene Royle for this month's episode. Hey, Marlene.
Hi, Rebecca. Hello, Faster Masters. Nice to be here.
Now, first, a message from our sponsors. Remember, this show and all of the shows on the RowingChat network would not be possible without our sponsors. We are hoping that you, our audience, will go to their websites and take a look at their products and services. We really appreciate the support you can give us, and it really helps us to bring you the rowing content that we know you love. So our first advert is for Just Strong. They're an athletic lifestyle brand for strong women. They offer encouragement and support, and they suggest you never give up. What does getting better at rowing mean to you? Progress, not perfection, is the perfect phrase tank shirt designed by the Just Strong team for strong women. You can get a 10% discount when you buy using the coupon code REBCAROE10, RebCaroe10, and of course, you'll be supporting RowingChat. Now, the link is in the show notes. Our second sponsor is the international athlete Annie Vernon, who has written a book called Mind Games. You can win yourself a personally signed and dedicated copy of the Mind Games book, which is all about how elite athletes train their minds to help them at sport. To enter the contest, tell us what gives you the impetus to win, and write a comment on the page rowing.chat/win-mind-games-book. And if you want a signed copy, you can just buy one for yourself at Rock the Boat UK, thanks to Di Binley, who has done this deal with us. You will find both of those links on rowing.chat/sponsor. Now, on with the show, Marlene. What have we got for May?
Well, our first topic we're going to talk about is how to fit working out into your workday. And of course, we can think about our traditional early morning workout, and you get up and you're very well organized, and you get to the boathouse or you get on the erg, and you feel great all day because you've gotten your workout behind you. But we don't always have a perfect world. So, and depending what type of schedule you have, you may have to fit in your training in many different situations and many different schedules. And Concept 2 had a great article in their newsletter recently about how some of their employees fit working out into their day in really creative ways. And at Concept 2, people have flexible hours. So they can, as long as they get their work done, they can come in when they want, they can go home when they want, etc. So it was great with a lot of creative tips. And one of the first ones was just move. If you don't have enough time to do a formal workout in a day, do anything you can to move, like take the stairs, have walking meetings outside with somebody. At Concept 2, they actually have a fairly large workout room, which is kind of a CrossFit style gym. So sometimes they sit on the bikeErgs and they have meetings while they're on the bikeErgs and talking. But those kinds of creative things, walk around the parking lot a few times, things like that, if you don't have time to actually get into the gym. Of course, the most reliable way is to put it on your schedule. And if you're working and you know that you can take a longer lunch, maybe you can afford 75 minutes for lunch or 90 minutes for lunch, and that's enough time to schedule a class. If there's a local gym, or sometimes in your, maybe you have a corporate gym where you work and they offer classes, but having a class that's, say, a midday when you know you can take a break is a nice way to guarantee your workout time, or simply make that the appointment with yourself. It can just be your sacred time that you say, okay, between 1 and 2, I can take a late lunch or cover for somebody else. I can go do my workout. I can do a 50-minute workout and come back to the desk or whatever your job is. But, block out that time for yourself. That's really important. And I like the comment of replace coffee with meters. And it's really easy, of course. I'm sure if you work in an office and there are a lot of people who tend to congregate near the coffee machine. If you do have a corporate gym, then it's perfect. Like catch up with people in the gym and socialize with people in the gym instead of standing around the coffee machine. So, you could easily be erging next to somebody or go out for a jog with somebody who you work with. And, it's a nice way, I think, even in the morning to catch up, to socialize with your friends and get your workout in at the same time. You can kind of do two things at the same time. If you like to chat and it's not the type of workout that you have to not talk. If it's an intense workout, that might be hard to do. Getting outdoors during the day, a lunchtime break or little extra time at lunchtime, I think is a really great way to squeeze in a workout. If you like to run or bike, you can certainly get outside, or even just a really fast walk. You can still get your heart rate up to, 120 or 125 with a really, really fast walking rate, especially if you have a hill. So that's one way you can squeeze a workout in. And a comment of what some people did is they scheduled their workout, or they planned their workout for the end of the workday. So this way you don't have to take a shower in the middle of the day. You just wait till the end of the day and do your workout between the end of your workday and when you get home. And then you kind of finish your day on a high note and you feel really good and accomplished, and you didn't blow it off that day, right? You feel better. And then, you can shower when you get home, and you don't have to spend time during your workday for that extra 15 minutes that you would have if you had to do it in the morning. And I think midday breaks are great, because if you're having a stressful day, it's not just a nice way to sort of press the reset button and discharge a little bit, relax, and your brain always works better after training, and it has a chance to file away all the little digital clutter you were dealing with in the morning. So it's a nice way to break the day into 2 phases and go into the afternoon or go home on a fresh note. So I thought it was a really nice practical article with some really good ideas.
That's great. I totally agree. Also, if you travel for work and you end up in airports, which are generally large places, I suggest you always walk from the gate to wherever you have to go next. Walk briskly, don't take the travelator. And if you want a little bit of a strength workout, carry your baggage. Don't use the rollers on your suitcase. Now, that means you have to change hands, but you could count your paces. 20 paces holding in your right hand, 20 paces holding your left hand. And if you really wanted 20 paces holding it in front of your chest, you can also just do easy things like you're waiting in the lounge to board, hold your luggage and do some squats. Just stand back.
Yeah.
People will probably think you're weird, but
you can squeeze your glutes and nobody will know you're doing it. And that's going to really help your drive suspension.
Good point.
It's true. It's true.
And
but
for hill sprints for me are always a good one if you've only got a really limited amount of time. And if you don't have a hill, if your building has a staircase, you can run up the stairs and walk down. Try not to run down the stairs. Personally, I've twisted my knee doing that. But just doing 1 flight, and then you can build up to doing 2 or 3 flights. And trust me, in most office buildings, no one uses the staircases.
Right. No, that's excellent. And that's very good for rowing. You sort of simulate running Harvard stadiums, or take 2 steps, and get it more of a power step. But
exactly. You can do 2 steps without running. You can actually walk 2 steps, and it's almost like doing a standing lunge. And you can use the handrail if you need it. There's no shame in that, but build up to, maybe you can do 5 paces without the handrail and then another 5 with the handrail, and then you turn the corner and
Yeah, so there are lots of ways to fit things in, and even if you don't have, say you don't have a block of 1 hour and you have a really busy day, I mean, just going out to walk for 15 or 20 minutes, maybe you do it in the morning, maybe you do it in the afternoon or something, you know, just short things, even 20, 25 minutes still count. That still adds up as being a productive day instead of losing a day and just not doing anything. So those short
Remember,
little sessions.
if you want to increase the intensity of a workout, carrying weight with you makes you work harder. It's kind of one of those things they do to encourage people who've been on a weight loss diet, is that they then make them wear a jacket which has additional little weights in it to reflect the amount of body mass they've lost. But if you remember, you know, if you have a backpack where you've got your computer or something, or your clothes, you can be sweaty running with a backpack, which isn't pleasant, but running with a bit of extra weight makes you work harder. Cool. We ready for our next topic?
I think so.
Steering in training.
Yeah, this is one of, I know this is one of your specialties for sure. And everybody goes, "Oh no, I have to tow the quad. It's my turn this time." But I think you'll get them on the right track.
Here's the moment where the US English and the English are at odds. Being towy is actually quite rude in English. Look it up in the Urban
We won't say that.
So I love steering. Steering is a skill which I've worked very hard to acquire, and it's a skill that I pretty much insist everybody in our club learns to do, because my club rows on a reasonably small lake. It's 1K across the diameter and it's 3K around the perimeter. So we all have to learn how to go around corners. Before starting to steer, particularly if you are using a boat which is shared with other crews and you can't guarantee someone hasn't changed the setup, let's just run through the kind of pre-outing checks you need to do. Put the boat on trestles and work with a friend. If you are the person who's going to be in the steering seat, go to the shoes that you're going to be using and look at them and have the other person hold the rudder straight. So most boats nowadays have a fin which is right next, or a skeg, which is right next door to the steering rudder. So the two are mounted adjacent underneath the stern of the boat. Have them put their hands under the boat and with their hands push them both together so they can tell that the skeg and the rudder are in a straight line. Once they've done that, without touching it, you look at the shoe. Now, the shoe is attached to a wire, and it doesn't matter if you're in the stroke seat or the bow seat or whichever seat is steering. You have usually a mounting space which is around 10 centimeters wide, where the wire comes out of the channels into a guide, and then it is loose. And then there's a mount point, which is usually has a wing nut, a butterfly nut, which joins them. First, check that when the rudder is straight, the shoe is pointing plumb in the middle between those two extremities. If you are an inexperienced steerer, this is your best guide, because you can visually check and look down and say, is this plumb in the middle? Then I know I have the rudder straight. Okay. Now, if you're a more experienced rower and steerer, you may choose to set the shoe somewhat differently. For example, my personal preference, I find it extremely difficult to sit with my feet perfectly parallel. I prefer them to be very slightly splayed. So I choose to set the straight rudder position somewhat off to one side. It's not very much, but you need to have a little bit of experience before you know what's right for you. So that's the first thing. Secondly, make sure that the wires are not too tight and not too slack. Now, some countries have a preference for the rudder wires to be crossed as it goes over the stern canvas, and some prefer uncrossed. If you're in an unfamiliar boat, check which one it is, because obviously that would change the direction the boat moves when you point your toe to the right. If the wires,
that's also probably a good point. If you go to a regatta such as FISR World Masters and you're renting a boat, and perhaps you're rowing a boat that is set up differently from what you row at home, that might be something that somebody would want to check ahead of time.
Yeah, and
Definitely.
It's very hard at a regatta to have enough time to change the wires, because to cross the rudder wires over requires extra wire length, and there may not be enough there. Now, when the wires are crossed, if you point your toe to the right, the boat will move to the right. If you point your toe to the left, the boat will move to the left. If the wires are uncrossed, you have to think, I'm pointing my heel to the right to go right. Okay, so that's the difference, heel versus toe. Now, if you move the foot stretcher in some particularly old boat designs and you move the foot stretcher towards the stern, it slackens off the rudder wires. Generally, the fix for this is to buy some bicycle brake cable. This is a plastic coated tubular wire through which you thread the steering wire. And what this does is it allows you to have a bend in the wire without you losing the tension that you need to be effective. Because if you have slack wires, it makes the steering very unresponsive. If you have too tight wires, it's really hard to move your shoe. The other thing to look at when you're setting it up is, where are the wires mounted on the T-bar above the steering post? So basically there's a tubular post that goes through the hull of the boat through which the rudder fits. So the rudder is a stem with the square rudder blade on the bottom, and it bolts through the T-bar. If you have a lot of T-bars only have single holes on the outside through which the rudder wires thread. Some, however, have more than one hole, and this is what affects your choice. If you mount the wires closer to the center of the spindle, so the center of the T-bar, you will get a much sharper turning circle. You will make a small movement with your foot and the boat will turn very sharply, because the angle that it moves the rudder correspondingly is much sharper. If you mount them at the end of the T-bars, it's a much more gentle response, and particularly for beginners, I recommend mounting at the edge of the T-bars. Now, the last thing to consider when you're setting it up is how high are the shoes on the foot plate. When you are steering, and particularly when you're learning to steer, the hardest thing is to know whether you have moved your foot unconsciously. And the best way to overcome this is to set the height of the shoes so that the heel of your right shoe, which is the one that controls the steering, just touches onto the knob which is between your heels for the foot stretcher adjustment. Now, nowadays you can get different types of knob. There's the thumb screw type, which is maybe 2 inches tall and is a tapered 10mm nut in a tube. There is a wing nut, which is just a butterfly nut. And then there's also the Martinoli knob, which are the same knobs that close the gates. I have also seen, particularly in more recent boats made by, I think, Swift and also Filippi, that they have a lever arrangement whereby there's a little threaded screw in the middle of the lever. It's unbelievably fiddly to fit it onto the threaded bolt in the first place. But once you've got it on, you clamp it down. Now, if you clamp it down 90 degrees square to perpendicular to the foot stretcher, that's fine. It's in line with the black track that your foot stretcher mounts on. But if you mount it slightly off to the right-hand side, just so that your heel just butts up against it when the shoe is plumb straight for steering, it gives you something to check whether your foot is straight. So you're rowing along and you can just think, just going to squeeze my heel a little bit to the left and check that it's touching the clamp. And that helps you to control the urge, because you're not used to having a foot that moves. Particularly if you're doing sweep, you'll be sweeping around your rigger, whichever side you row. The tendency is to move your heel if you're not conscious of keeping it still. So there you go.
That's a lot to process at first. I mean, and that's just getting it set up. That's not even practicing it yet. And will you tell us how and when we should make a correction when we're using a toe?
Well, there's a great thing. So you're on the water and you're rowing. There are two schools of thought, and this applies to coxing as well. School of thought number one says you should steer when the oars are in the water because the boat becomes unstable when you steer it. However, when the oars are in the water, the hull shape and the propulsive force of the oars are designed to send the boat in a straight line. So your steering is actually less effective. It doesn't stop the boat turning. It's just harder and it takes longer to make a turn around a particular angle. The other way is to steer when the oars are out of the water, because if you are on a high balance and your oars are not touching the water, the steering just directly affects the hull itself. And this can cause wobbles. I personally steer when it is needed, and I pay no regard to whether the oars are in or out of the water, partly because I have tried only steering when the oars are out of the water, and it was incredibly difficult to steer correct back when you took the oars, when you put the oars in the water, steer again and correct back. I've found that personally a lot more challenging than just steering when it was needed. What's your
well, that sounds like it. I think that sounds like a more organic approach, because if you're trying to also match when the oars are in the water and when they're out of that, that adds a whole nother layer of complexity. And if you're in a race situation, maybe you're rowing with the sweep oar, so you're rowing off to one side, so you've got that asymmetry, then you're focusing on your foot, then you're trying to race, then perhaps you're giving commands. Now, do you usually have the person who is steering also be the person who is calling out commands, or do you assign that to another person in the boat?
My preference is to assign it to someone else. So there are actually two jobs when you're calling commands. There are jobs related to the rowing that you're doing, and that should go to another person. The job of calling when it relates to steering should go to the steers person, because they have the ability to, for example, say you're just coming toward the end of the lake, and you can call out next stroke, easy oars, or way enough.
And how about just tapping it? Do you just do small little touches? Because obviously if you make a really hard abrupt turn, could that disrupt the crew? Or what do you think for somebody who's just starting to steer? And obviously there's a lot going on. I mean, I haven't towed a quad in a long time. I can imagine if I got in one now, I'd be thinking, wow, there's a lot going on here. You know, what's the best way to not interrupt the boat, but still try to do what you need to do? How often do you try to touch it, or how sensitive are you to these things?
So when someone is steering for the very first time, what I do is I always suggest that during the warm-up, you row with 50% of the crew doing their warm-up at a time. And the first piece is the people who are not steering. So say it's a quad and you have the steering at bow pair sit it out, and stern pair do their warm-up. So two can do the calls, three, and bow can just steer. Now, in terms of steering, when you are steering from bow, you need to understand a couple of things. Firstly, you are the person who is in charge of what is in front of you. And if you're on a straight lane course, you don't have to look around, because you can see the buoys going either side of you. And you have this wonderful moment where you know they are parallel lines, but they obviously have a vanishing point as they go into the distance. And you can judge without moving your head whether the gap on the right of the boat and the gap on the left is equivalent, and whether or not those lines are converging behind the head of the stroke guy. If you're not on a buoyed course, you're on a river or a lake where you have to go, you have to look where you're going, you need to judge a couple of things. Firstly, realize that when you look over your right shoulder, the view in front of you is different from when you look over your left shoulder. That's because you're not turning 100% of the way around like a full 180. So I always guide people, also when they're learning to steer single sculls and double sculls, that there are two ways to look around. One is a glance over your shoulder. So you turn your chin until it is over your right shoulder. or over your left shoulder. And if you have ever judged your peripheral vision, you can actually see a lot. And the way to find this out is to put your two fingers up with your arms straight in front of you and move your hands as you widen your arms slowly out to the side. And you get to a point where your fingers go out of view. You don't move your head, you're still looking forward. And you realize that actually you have a very wide field of vision. So when you're doing this little 90-degree glance, chin on your shoulder, you can actually see quite a long way in front of you. The second way to look around is to physically turn. And what you'll need to do is bend probably one of your arms and drop one of your shoulders so that you can twist and rotate all the way around until you can see the bow ball of your boat, because there is a blind spot which you are not covering when you do the little glance look around. So when people are starting, I recommend they alternate. If you have the bank on your left-hand side and you know the river well enough to know that it's straight for a bit and then it has a left-hand bend, you can steer just by looking at the bank and judging the distance your boat is from the bank. But you should alternate the glance with the fully turn around and look at the bow ball. The other thing to realize when you're steering is people tend to assume that the boat steers directly under where they are sitting. That's because that is the perception you get when you are on a bicycle, a skateboard, or a motor vehicle, unless it's a long lorry or a truck. Basically, you feel that where you are sitting is the rotating turning point. In a rowing boat, it is not. The turning point is at the center of the boat. So in the 8, it's between the 4 and the 5 seat. In the 4, it's between the 2 and the 3 seat. And actually, that can be a long way from where you are sitting. So you have to also build that into your judgment about when you start to turn the rudder. When people are first learning, they tend to oversteer. And what that means is they turn too sharply and then they have to correct back. So while you're doing this warm up and you're sitting still and the rest of the boat is rowing, what I recommend you do is try to keep your foot straight. And then when you need to steer, look first before you turn your foot. Look, make a judgment call, and make a very small movement in your foot. After you've done that movement, remember you need to hold your foot over in that position. Look at the horizon behind you. You may have a tree or a bush on the bank or a building that you can see whether it is moving relative to the heads of the guys in front of you in the boat. And you will be able to see if the boat is beginning to turn, and you'll be able to judge the speed at which the boat is beginning to turn in the direction that you've indicated. Start to steer slightly earlier than you think while you are learning, because you will then steer gently, as I've suggested, and take your time making the maneuver. Yes, it means there are more strokes and potentially more strokes where the boat is wobbly, but it will allow you to acquire better judgment about the speed the boat's moving, the speed with which the obstacle, which may be a corner or a buoy, is coming up, and also the arc of the circle that you're trying to turn around. And all of those things change when you have a different crew, different wind conditions, different stream. And so it takes quite a bit of practice to get used to doing these things. Now, if you have the stroke person steering, they can't look around. So they have to work very closely with the bow person. The bow person will be doing the same look around I just described. And you have to establish a clear language between the two of you to understand what they mean. Now, I'm going to give you some examples that I've heard used. You start by saying the word steering so that only the person who's steering knows that this instruction is for them. And you can say steering bow side. Now, that has two meanings. It might mean they want you to move toward bow side, or it might mean they want pressure on the bow side oars in order to move towards stroke side. So before you go on the water, you need to establish the language that you use. And generally, if you're in a training group or a club, you will tend to find that there's a common language develops that everybody understands, and then it becomes standard. You don't need to explain it. But you can also just say left and right, steer right. And that means you want the boat to move toward the right-hand side. Remember that you are all sitting facing the same direction in a coxless boat. And so the right-hand side is the stroke side of the boat, which is port, correct?
Yes, red. Port wine is red.
Port is red. Port wine is red. That's it.
Yes. That's red a new Faster Masters motto.
Oh, exactly.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So language is really important. Now, for myself, if I'm in the bow seat and I'm not steering, I'm giving instruction to the person who's steering at stroke. What I often do is I have gradations of steering required. So if we're going around our lake and we know that there's a red buoy in front of the pump house, we're going in a straight line, and I will say something like, start the corner now. Steering is the first word, start the corner now. And what will happen is the person knows that it's a 90-degree bend. They will start the steering. And what the stroke person does then usually is they look out over their right shoulder to see the red buoy. Once they've started the steering, they'll probably know at what point they can see it. And then once they've actually seen it, then they can make a grade adjustment as to the steepness of the turn that they're making. And then as we go around the red buoy and we're straightening out, I will then look over my shoulder, check when we're straight, and then I will say straight very loudly. And at that point, the steering person turns their shoe so that they are now square off and the shoe is straight. Because one of the things you have to learn in steering is that you've got to make a steer and then correct back to a neutral so that the rudder is straight with the fin. The second type of instruction I give is when I need a tighter curve. And again, as I explained, this might be because the boat's going faster or because I've misjudged a distance. And so what I do is I say steering hard. And that tells the person I don't want a gentle curve. I want them to lam that steering right over so that we turn hard. Quickly, exactly. And if needed, and I am looking while they're making this maneuver, and we're not going to make the corner, I then have two choices. One is to say stop, just have everyone stop rowing, and we can then stop, and when we're stationary, make the adjustment. Or I can say add pressure on the bow side or the stroke side so that you then have the rowers join in and add a bit of pressure, which increases the turning arc.
Well, it's an incredible skill, and I think you've just given a great systematic overview, especially of the communication in the boat. I mean, that's very important that someone understands what the commands are, and if you're, I mean, this can create appreciate your bowman day. I think, you know, somebody who's a good bowman, I mean, that it's a fantastic skill. And when you think of the speed you could be moving in a quad in a racing situation, not only steering on a straight course, but on a very complex course, that's, you know, it really takes a lot of skill. And one of the drills for people in singles that I like to have them do when they're learning how to steer is do an exercise of 10 strokes. And one stroke they look over one shoulder, the next stroke they look over the next shoulder, and they just not the complete turn, but they just turn so that they can try to see the bow ball with their peripheral vision and just get accustomed to turning to both sides, because typically you're going to favor one side or the other, depending which way you're comfortable with your neck turning. And in a single, if you have to make some corrections, for example, and you don't want the boat to lose speed, you can steer and get around quite a sweeping turn by alternating your leg pressure. So if you don't want to interrupt your drive, you can press much harder with your outside leg that's on the outside and completely ease off on the inside leg. And what that does is that helps your boat actually glide around the turn, instead of, if you come really hard on your opposite arm, the bow pushing against the water. So instead of it banking, the boat can glide. Now it takes some practice to do that, because the boat doesn't move really quickly. You have to get a good estimate of, how many strokes it would take you to correct, or for example, in the head of the Charles, to get around the Cambridge turn, it's a very, very, very long turn. But if you can start to master some of that, that's one way that you can pick up some speed, or not lose so much speed when you steer, because every time you look out of the boat, you're also going to lose a little bit of speed. So that's another thing to experiment with in a smaller. You could maybe in a double, or in a single, you could experiment with that, or in your quad if you're towing, and you need something between hard on port or starboard. In between, you might say, more pressure on the starboard leg. That might be enough to help it without it coming into the oars too. So those are things that people can try.
I love that Cambridge turn, because
yeah,
I can win races there, because I'm happy with my oars going over the buoy line.
Well, you want your oars over the buoy line. I mean, the ideal is to run your rigger right over the buoy line, and as long as your hull does not cross the buoy line, you're legal. And especially for people who do that race the first time, just being an oar length out slightly wide can add 20 seconds to your time. So it's worth practicing these elements. But if you're on a 1K course, which people are now getting into 1K racing season, correcting, if you can correct with your leg drive, that also won't be as disruptive. Or I would say if you're going to, say, take a power 10 or a focus 10, I know I always liked to include 1 or 2 strokes to check my steering before I did that. Because if you start to go off, you want to make a correction 1 or 2 strokes. You don't want to wait until you're already on the buoy line, then to have to come back into the center of your lane. So that takes a lot of concentration and practice.
It does, particularly if you're racing in a crosswind, as I was at the weekend.
Right.
Over toward the stroke side quite often. And yeah, that's great advice. So let's have a talk about how you can practice steering during your training, because practicing things in your training is much more constructive in the long term than having to learn them during a race. Marlene, what are your tips for ways to practice steering?
Well, if you have a group of scullers, a fun way is to do something like Indian sprints. So say you have maybe 3 or 4 scullers rowing together, and the first drill is to just row single file, like row in a line without touching each other and trying to gauge people's speed and staying in formation. And then as part of you can build the workout into it, that say the person at the tail drops over to the side, and then they have to sprint to the front of the line, and then they row. You decide with your group, are you going to row 1 minute or 2 minutes, and then the next person sprints to the top and then gets into single file. So you practice rowing single file, but also moving out to the side, getting enough clearance that you row by them without clashing oars. And then they have to slow down a little bit to make sure that you can tuck in. So you actually have to practice quite a few skills like that. Or you can do fun things like rowing in formation. Like you all decide, if say you have 3 friends out sculling, and you all line up across, and you decide, we're just going to have, a blade length in between each of us, and you try to row together in one line across without clashing oars, and just trying to stay parallel, but as close as you can. So things like that are just fun games that you can do in part of your warm-up, or if you're just being silly, but they're really good exercises for just trying to row close to someone. And of course, in your practices, if you're doing longer intervals, it's very good to get 2 boats or 3 boats, if you have the space, side by side, Or if you're doing something like a set stroke rate workout where you can try to keep the boats together as much as possible so that they can actually practice having somebody very close to you and having to steer and getting used to the noise of another boat. Or if you're in an 8, the noise of another coxswain in the next boat. These are all things, if you train by yourself, you might not be familiar with this, just the commotion of a lot of people being close to you. Starts are really good to do together. And that way crews won't get separated. If you're doing shorter starts, 10 strokes, 20 strokes, you can probably keep boats together than if you are doing maybe longer pieces and one boat's clearly faster than the other boat. But all of those types of things that you can do competitively, even your steady state rowing, you can do it side by side and put that steering component into the practice, and with a coach's supervision, if they're there, they can try to keep the boats together, which is desirable if you'd like coaching. If one boat rows away from the coach, they're not going to get very much coaching. So staying together is a really big priority. But when you're in a straight boat without a coxswain, you really have to practice that to get ready for race day, especially if you train by yourself.
Yeah. So just a bit of guidance. If you're going to do any of those things Marlene has suggested, before you start and you're lining up and the boats are all stationary and you're 3 abreast or whatever, agree what point you are steering toward. Unless you are on a buoyed straight lane course, you can, assuming that you've got at least 1 kilometer to row before you have to stop or go around a corner, all agree to point your bows at the same object in the distance. Now, this sounds counterintuitive because it sounds like you will all converge and clash. But trust me, you won't, because it's a bit like the parallel lines of the buoy lines converging. So on our lake, when we're on the far side and we're coming across our 1K measured course, there are 2 very tall pine trees that are on the skyline, and we agree which pine tree we are pointing towards. Because if you try and say, I will point to the right of the pine tree and you point to the left, what will happen is you'll row off and the 2 boats will diverge very, very quickly. You actually want to be pointing at the same thing. If you're the bowman, turn around and look over both shoulders to line up your bow with that pine tree so that you can be sure that you are actually pointing towards it. And I was going to add one variant drill to Marlene's side-by-side Indian sprints, which is, we call it leapfrogging. And you can do it with 2 crews. One goes at half pressure and the other one goes at firm. But instead of having to swing out and move around the other crew and back in again, particularly in singles, it takes too long. Just do it parallel. So you both row off at half pressure. And when one crew then says they will go firm, and they go firm pressure at the same rate until their stern is level with the bow of the other crew that's going half pressure. And then the stroke man yells, go. And then the crew that's at half pressure moves up to firm. The crew that's at firm pressure moves down to half pressure. And they go firm pressure until their stern is level with the bow of the other crew. And their stroke man says go. And you're basically shuffling one forward and the other forward. So you're practicing steering in a straight line, practicing going past another crew, practicing variations in pressure as well.
That sounds like a really fun workout.
It is. It's really competitive. Because of course,
I was going to
cheat.
Right, and it's a nice way.
We're at half pressure plus a little bit.
Right. Everybody's, itching to go, but it's a nice way to add in, for example, if you're to add in like some 30-second sprints, or depending on the boat, short little quick things where you can focus on your blade work. You can focus, you can pick the rating up really high to focus on coordination and blade work, which you have to practice as we're going into racing season. And at the same time, it doesn't raise the stress level of the workout to a huge degree because it's very short. It's very anaerobic. So those are great little drills to practice and fun.
Yeah. Count the number of strokes it takes you to get in front of the other crew. You're trying to do it in the minimum possible. So it's also about stroke efficiency. Okay. I think we've done that to death. Let's talk about 1K race plans.
Oh, now we have to race? No.
It's that time of year. We've
I
already had
know.
our big regatta. The North Island Masters Championships, the Legion Regatta, was last weekend. So, yeah.
Yes, well, I think, Australia, New Zealand, they have 1K races. I'm in Florida right now, and there are a lot of spring races that go on in Florida here, and they haven't started up north yet because it's still quite cold in New England, but they will towards the end of May. They're kind of in the mid-Atlantic, and then they move up. So we are getting into the season, and we have talked about race planning principles before when we've talked about head race planning, and 1K race planning is quicker, and I think you have to be more precise. In a 1K race plan, first of all, your start is worth about 8% of your race. So having a very accurate plan for what you're going to do in that first 20 strokes is very important in a 1K race, because if you have a stroke that catches water or is a little bit deep or something that throws you off just a little bit, you don't have as much time to overcome that stroke as you would in a longer race. So I think it's very important to be very clear about what you want to focus on in your race. What are your strengths and weaknesses? Where do you need a little bit of extra mental support to get through the third 250 meters, which is the hardest for everybody? And you can approach it according to your personality. Some people like very detailed plans where they count strokes. Other people don't want to do that at all. They want to just focus on a technical point or a couple of keywords that they use, and they don't want to be specific and count strokes. It's really up to you. It's really whatever works. The goal is to keep your mind in the boat and keep your focus clear so that each stroke is a race unto itself. And the more you can do to keep yourself in the present, the better race you're going to have, and a race that focuses on your strengths. Because if you know that you don't have that second gear that you can pull a sprint out of a hat, then you have to win the race in the middle of the race. You have to know that, oh, this person has a really strong sprint, so I have to try to get ahead of them on average pace. So you have to know a little bit what type of athlete you are and how you race to determine what you focus on. The goal is to row well every stroke, and to make your technique condition resistant, meaning that your technique is solid so that you can row in any type of conditions and be as efficient as possible, because that's really where the skill of racing comes in, and your experience comes into being able to handle a lot of different situations. Know your course too. Yeah. And know the course you're racing on.
Yeah. It's so important. I have a base plan that I personally use and I teach, but once the whistle blows, you have to respond to whatever happens on the water. If your start is not as good as you had hoped, or if you suddenly find you're a length clear with 250 meters gone, well, you don't need to sprint down the rest of the course, particularly if you have another race later in the day, or you're neck and neck with someone. You may need to be pushing much earlier than the markers that you had originally planned. So remember, it's a guide only, and you have to be very responsive to the actual situations you find yourself in. And the more you race, the more different situations you will find yourself in, the more you will learn about your capabilities to respond in those different situations, the more you can try different things. So I have had races that have been won by around 0.1 of a second, precisely 0.1 of a second, which is around 1.5 centimeters. So that's a half a bow ball. And we won that race because we started our sprint earlier than the crew who we were side by side with.
It's good to have some practice with different situations. So, for example, simulate disasters. Simulate, somebody simulate bowman catches a crab. As a crew, have a backup plan. What if somebody crabs? What are you going to do to pick speed up again? Things like this are important. What do you do if your steering goes off? Sometimes you have to, you have to be able to regroup in the middle of a race. Or what if you're just not getting into your rhythm and the boat just feels terrible, and you know that the day before your boat had a beautiful row and had great swing and great rhythm, and today everything feels off. Try to work these things out in practice. Like, go out and start rowing at a really terrible rhythm and try to figure out what calls are going to get you all back together. Have your focus, whether it's hands away or bodies over, or focus on relaxing the hands or quiet blade work. But try to figure out things and when you're having a day that's less optimal, try to figure out what's a key thing that everybody can relate to, that can get you back in rhythm if things didn't start correctly. And because it happens some days, some days you have a little bit off day, or it just doesn't feel like it's going right. Or what if you go off course? What are your calls to get the boat back on course? So the more scenarios that you can practice. What if a boat crashes into you? You clash oars. What's the command? Yeah, exactly. So the more things as a crew you can come up with and practice, the better prepared you're going to be for what probably, on race day, something always goes wrong. So you have to be prepared for anything, any kind of conditions, any kind of wind. So if you can, those are fun things you can work into your practice, that, what if this happens? Now, how are we going to get back on track?
Absolutely. And I think this is a timely moment to remind everyone that if they want to buy Marlene's 12-week training plan for 1K racing, you can buy it at rowperfect.co.uk. Just search for Faster Masters and you'll find it in their ebooks section. Now, you had a listener tell you something about her 1K plan. What was that, Marlene?
Yeah, well, I often ask athletes that I work with to send me their 1K race plans. And we actually, as their coach, that's one of the things we do, is we work on their plan as if we're choreographing their race. So I always ask them to write it out. And sometimes if somebody hasn't been very clear about their race plan, this is where we find the gaps. If they're telling me, I'm having trouble with a certain part of my race plan, I ask them to write it out. And then if they don't have a plan, we start working on creating one. But this is one that one athlete sent to me. And she was an athlete who her peak race was often Canadian Henley. And so this was her race plan that she sent to me. She said, in my first 250 meters, I do 5 starting strokes: half, three-quarters, length, and full. My focus is light hands and feel the boat pick up speed. Then 10 high strokes, really a builder at 35 or 36 strokes per minute, focusing on blade depth, and I try not to rush, let the boat run. Then 10 settle strokes at about 30. I focus on the release and acceleration, getting into my rhythm. In the second 250 meters, I row 10s. I focus on elements of the stroke that help me row well: blade depth, relaxed shoulders, acceleration. In the third 250, I do a special 10, and that depends on how things are going. I like this one. Maybe it's a power 10, or picking up the rate for 10, or maybe it's a settle 10 so I get back into my rhythm. Or maybe it's 10 for me to check my steering and make a correction. But I try to focus on keeping rhythm and getting ready for the sprint. So she's good at getting through the third 250, because that's usually an area of the race where people have to get through by 5s or by 3s, because it's a hard part of the stroke of the race. And then she says, in my final 250 meters, at the 700 and 50 meter mark. I pick the rate up 2 strokes per minute every 10 strokes until the finish line. I just think about relaxed shoulders, strong legs to improve the finish, and accelerating the boat. So I think this is a really nice example of a well thought out plan, and she leaves herself a little room in case she needs to do something. She knows this is where I'll put in that 10 for whatever I think I need right at that moment. And it's a nice structure, but at the same time gives her room to improvise as needed.
Exactly. And she's obviously an experienced athlete, and she has a load of different kind of tricks she can pull out of her bag. If you're a new crew, my advice would be to only have 2 tricks and practice only 2. You need a power trick and you need a technical trick. And your technical trick can be whatever you need. It might be early catches, it might be holding on to the finish, but you can alternate those if you need right the way down the 1K course. Just do your start, and then you can just start calling power 10, catches 10, power 10, catches 10 as often as you need. Because if you haven't had time to practice much together, you're far better to keep it real simple and just doing 2 things rather than having the sophistication of a really experienced racer who, I'm guessing she's probably in her single for that, isn't she, Marlene?
Yes, she is, yes. But well, also if they're calling, I was going to say, if in a novice crew, if they're working by 10s and they know how many strokes it takes them to row the race, it also keeps them in the present so they know where they are all the way down the course. If they're going by 10s and they know this, the race takes me X number of strokes, that's also a good marker for people not to get ahead of themselves and not to get anxious about where's the finish line. They know I'm at the 500, I'm at the 600. So I think that's important for good focus as well.
Brilliant. Marlene, again, it's been a blast. This is Faster Masters Rowing Radio for May 2019. Where can people connect with you online, Marlene?
My website is roylerow.com, ROYLE.com, and my email is roylerow@gmail.com.
And you can connect with me, and any questions you have or remarks can be added to the rowing.chat website. When you go to the website, there's a menu item called episodes, and you can add comments underneath them. Remember, we also link our shows to the Rowing Illustrated boards, thanks to Sean Wolfe, who's joined RowingChat as a podcast host. He has made a discussion board just for the podcasts. And so each episode has a separate discussion thread up there. And of course, there is also the Reddit thread, Reddit/rowing, where there is a very diverse discussion on all sorts of things. And occasionally podcasts are mentioned there, although we don't, as a matter of course, put RowingChat stuff up there every week. Faster Masters Rowing Radio is part of the RowingChat network. You can get email notifications of our new shows by joining the mailing list at rowing.chat. And please rate us in iTunes or Google Play and join our subscriber list, because it helps us to get more listeners. Listen to the other shows in the network, wherever you get your podcasts, and tell your friends. Till next time, goodbye.